Good afternoon, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this panel on gender and mediation, the role of women in conflict resolution. My name is Meli Caballero Anthony from RSIS Nanyang Technological University of Singapore. I'm moderating this panel with excellent panelists, and I would like to introduce them. Their names should be on the screen, but anyway, starting from my far right, we have Ambassador Delia Albert, who was the former Foreign Secretary of the Philippines, actually the first female Foreign Secretary of the Philippines. And on her right is Ambassador Yvonne Baki, who is the Ambassador of Ecuador to Qatar. And following that is Dr. Ann Phillips, from the Senior Advisor from the U.S. Institute of Peace. And last but not least, Meenakshi Gopinath, who is the Executive Director of WISCOMT in India. It's been 18 years since the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 1325 that look at the impact of conflict and violence on women, but most importantly, stress the need for women participation, full and equal participation in peace processes. Mindful that there can be no peace without security, and there cannot be full security, which is not inclusive. It is therefore goes without saying that women have to be part of any peace processes. An old Chinese leader once said that women hold half of the sky. So it doesn't make sense if women are excluded in these peace processes. Since the adoption of the Resolution 1325, there's been a number of other UN resolutions and UN frameworks looking at, for example, increasing the protection of women against sexual violence and enhancing women's participation both on the 4 pillars of protection, prevention, participation, relief, and recovery. Now, because this is the almost penultimate panel in Doha session, and because this is a group of friends, we thought that we will adopt a slightly different tack to this panel presentation. We're going to have a conversation rather than a formal presentation, and we hope that you can also be actively engaged in this conversation. So just to kick off, I would like to ask our friends here to reflect on where we are as far as the goals of 1325 is, and more importantly, where we are when it comes to promoting and advancing the active participation of women in the whole gamut of peace processes. Let me start with Anne, who can give us a broad overview of the progress in UN peace operations and women's participation. Anne.
Thank you, Meli, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you and look forward to the conversation. Of course, women in peace building and conflict resolution is multifaceted. I just want to hone in on UN peacekeeping operations. I've had the opportunity to do workshops with peacekeepers who are going to deploy in a half-a-dozen countries in recent years. And as Meli mentioned, 1325 mentions specifically about training for peacekeepers on protection of civilians, and particularly protection of women, that required special training. And also, in a companion to that, the importance of increasing the number of women who are in peacekeeping operations, not just on the civilian side, but on the uniform side, right? Because how are you going to do this? So, how has the UN, and I want to say, I have full respect for UN peacekeepers. They're operating in very difficult environments. I don't underestimate that at all. But how are UN peacekeepers doing in terms of increasing the number of women in the military, in the police? And I'm just speaking about uniformed services. Well, in 1993, according to UN data, there were 1% of women serving in the uniformed forces in UN peacekeeping operations. According to UN data in October of 2018, so this is very current, they have made some progress. 4% of military in UN peacekeeping operations are women. 12% of police are women. So there is some progress. But for practical purposes, not nearly enough. Why? When you deploy, or those who deploy, in these very difficult and fluid environments, the ability to interact with local women at the community level and so on is extremely important for the trust, building trust between UN peacekeepers and the local communities, right? And without that trust of the community in your mission as a UN peacekeeper, your prospects for success or progress are limited. And we've seen examples of that. Al-Ade in Somalia may be known to you. The relations between the peacekeepers and the community were very fraught and created a situation in which there were attacks against the peacekeepers. Okay, so very important to increase the number of women in the military and in the police. The increased number of women among peacekeepers in the uniformed services is, for practical purposes, so important because the military and police are often the first and regular interactors with the host country communities. And so the impression that is made, the ability to build trust, is extremely important. And in most of these environments, it is the women who can connect with the local populations of women. And as we know, dare I say this, women are very acute observers of the local environment and are often much better listeners, and they often have a much better idea of what is going on. And at the same time, that is extremely important. Also, women in the host country communities will have greater trust in UN peacekeepers when they are interacting with women. So for very practical reasons, this is very important. Women are have proven to be quite important in strengthening the performance of UN peacekeepers in protection of civilians, which, quite frankly, has been very much in question and has been challenged. And sexual exploitation and abuse, as we know, has been recorded in many missions. This undermines the trust between the peacekeepers and the local communities. If there were more women, and more women in higher ranks among UN peacekeepers, there would be a greater opportunity to perform better in these critical features. In workshops that I have done with UN peacekeepers, I run into very many very smart women, men too, but they are not of the rank where it's very difficult for them to call things out. But just as an example, the kinds of conversations that we have on sexual exploitation and abuse, women get right away. There can be no consensual sexual relationship between a UN peacekeeper and a woman under their control. The men don't necessarily get that. And they say, oh, well, it could be a mutual attraction and so on. No, it's all about power. And the women, more women and more women in positions of authority could go a long way in checking those abuses that have stained the credibility of UN peacekeeping missions in too many places. And I'll stop with that.
Thank you. That is for peacekeeping, but as we all know, conflict resolution there's a long process. It involves several other processes. There's, of course, after peacekeeping, there's peacemaking and peace building. I would like to draw on the experience of our two ambassadors from two specific regions, Asia and Latin America. So let me start with Ambassador Albert. If you could reflect on the experience of women mediators in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, thank you and good afternoon. I'm delighted that the conference has an agenda item on gender. Sometimes it gets lost in the other agenda items. So I thought perhaps I'd like to congratulate the organizers for putting in the agenda item on gender and mediation. As I reflected, what I could share with you perhaps is the fact that in 2004, when I chaired the Security Council, the Philippines was a non-permanent member of the Security Council at the time, and as a foreign minister, I had the choice of an agenda item. And I brought the agenda item on the role of civil society in post-conflict peace building. I thought perhaps it was too early to bring in civil society and the role of women as peace builders and peacemakers, that initially I got rejected. And they said, your topic, Madam Secretary, belongs to the Economic and Social Council. I said, no, I believe that post-conflict peace building is just as important as peace building, and that civil society has definitely a very important role in ensuring peace after the conflict has taken place. And I remember going into that Security Council chamber, and I looked around and I said, it's a room full of penguins. They were all men in dark suit and white shirts. So I said, all right, I will try my luck with the penguins. But luckily, Kofi Annan was very, very supportive. And he said, I will support you, you're the chairman, and you decide. So that was my first foray into bringing in the role of women and the role of civil society in post-conflict peace building, because I thought that that was a very important part in addressing a lot of our issues especially I was thinking of our own problems in the Philippines, a centuries old conflict in the southern islands of the country between the Muslim population that has been there for some time and the Christian population that came with the colonialists later on. This morning, I was quite impressed with one of the statements of a gentleman from Professor Garelli of the Lausanne Institute when he was asked what would be the greatest factor that would bring about change. And he said, civil society. So I ran up to him, I said, someone who thinks like me, and we really should work together, and we're going to work together on bringing in more civil society participation in the discussion not only of political issues, but of economic issues. This morning, we were all touched by the gripping story of Nadia Murad. And I felt that perhaps many of us have not really been looking at the fate of women in post-conflict areas of the world, which is really a lot. But that gave me more, perhaps, direction to move and do more on women participation, not only in mediation, but in negotiation. I am glad to just mention that after so many years of conflict in the Philippines, we decided a few years ago to have a negotiating team of 5 persons, of which 4 were women. It was a breakthrough because for the first time, women led the negotiations between the national government and the Muslim Liberation Front in the Philippines. And this has been centuries-old issue. And for the first time, we were able to develop a consensus on building a Bangsamoro uh, law, and which has now evolved into what they call the Bangsamoro Organic Law, which will be offered for plebiscite in the first part of this year. For us in the Philippines, it's a real breakthrough because this is the first time that there is a sense that a centuries-old problem of a conflict that is not just caused by religious differences, by culture, but also by neglect of the national government. And I think that it is historical that a negotiating team of 4 out of 5 were women. So perhaps that's what I could share on this first round. Thank you.
I was just wanted to add that in the region, Southeast Asia, there are at least 2 peace processes that are ongoing. And I think the lessons of the experience of the Philippines in having the active engagement of 4 women in the peace panel, I think is something that which has become a point of reference. But tell us about the experience in Latin America, Ambassador Yvonne.
Well, first of all, I'm so pleased to be here and to see that we have many men with us, which is great. When we met in the morning, we thought that it would have been great to have one man among us, which is better. I believe always that we should work together, men and women together for peace. That's needed. But my experience is, you know, it's difficult to tell, but since when I was born in Ecuador, very young, my parents from Lebanese origin, we traveled to Lebanon, and in Lebanon I married very young and I had children, and the war started in Lebanon, the civil war in the 70s. So when my children were born, the only thing they saw in Lebanon was bombs. So the music for my children to sleep were bombs. And at that time, women were not, in a way, even now, involved in trying to say a word or say something. So I couldn't believe why they kill people in the name of religion. What is it that's happening that you see people, you cannot do anything? So for me, not being able to speak, I went into the arts. For me, it was always music and the arts and painting, but I started painting mostly because I couldn't say it in words, so I would say it through the arts, through painting. And I would use always women as a symbol of peace, and mostly the eyes of women, because I could see in the eyes of this woman that they were saying, what are you doing with my children? It doesn't matter if they're mine or they are not. They are our children. So my decision was that I will do anything for peace, because I was born in Ecuador, a very peaceful country. So I started painting. I did, that was my career for many years, for 20 years. I started painting and exhibiting all over the world, and it was always the issue of women. Femmes d'Orient, le défi in Paris, Women of the Orient, and the challenge. It was always about the arts and about women and about how can we do something else. But then I realized that through the arts you can reach something, but you cannot reach more than that. So I was invited to be the artist in residence at Harvard University, and I was there. And someone told me, Yvonne, why don't you go to the Kennedy School and do your master's in politics and public administration and do something more than just in the arts, because you can reach to something but not more. So I did, and I think that changed my life, because my professor and my mentor was Roger Fisher, the guru of negotiations. And he was an amazing person, and Herbert Kellman also there were my professors. And we started because my dream was to make peace in the Middle East. I was not even thinking of Ecuador and Peru at that time. It was the Middle East, the dream of the Middle East. And Roger Fisher and Herbert Kellman were my professors, and they were doing it for the Middle East. They used to bring real-life negotiators, Palestinians and Israelis, in the table, and we would be, as students, sitting in a room that was with a glass that they couldn't see us, but we could see them. And I could see only men sitting in front of each other, the Palestinians and the Israelis, and just accusing each other. And when you accuse, you don't get into a solution. So I was saying, this is impossible. We have to have something beyond that. And Roger would say, yes, we need to have something beyond that. But what is it? So we started working on the issues of how to find ways. And I was always mentioning we need to have more women. There were always men, only men. I remember there was one woman, Hanan Ashrawi, that was fantastic. And she was fantastic. And because of her, they were reaching to an agreement, in a way, and they took her out because of that. So I decided that my life would be to fight for that. And it happened. I don't believe in coincidences. I believe there is a cause for everything. With the group of Roger Fisher, I became, after that, member of the conflict management group of him. And we were having dinner at my place at night in Boston. And the phone rings at 9 at night. It's the president of Ecuador. That was 1995. President Sixto Durán Ballén of Ecuador. He was calling me to ask me, please, Yvonne, the war is starting between Ecuador and Peru. And I would like very much to have Roger Fisher and the team to come over to Ecuador to do something. And I said, look, Mr. President, no coincidence. He's here with me. We're having dinner all together, the whole group of the conflict management group. So why don't you speak to him directly? So that's what happened, and then my life changed because after he spoke with him and we decided that we'll go to Ecuador, in 2-3 days we were in Ecuador, and the negotiations between Ecuador and Peru started with 5 persons, the teams of 5 from Ecuador and 5 from Peru. It was a border dispute that was very, very old, but the war started again. So what we did was Roger Fisher chose 5 Ecuadorians and 5 Peruvians to go into in a retreat at Harvard. And we did a retreat for 10 days. And the way we did it, I was the only woman. They were all men from different parts of society, civil society, the journalism, politics, military, artists. So it was academia. So we went for 10 days. But the way he did it was amazing. We exchanged places. I was raised in Ecuador that Peru is our enemy, because they took half of our land. They were not raised that way. So when we exchanged places, I became a Peruvian, he became, we found out that we have so many things in common. But we always don't see that. And the thing that is the most important is we have to be hard on the issue, on the problem, but soft on the people. And we're doing completely the opposite. We're being hard on the people and soft on the problem. When you sit on the table of negotiation, it shouldn't be a table in front of each other. It should be next to each other in a round table and put the problem in the middle and see, this is our problem, how do we solve it? And we women see things differently because we always try to find a way, which is a lose-lose. Give up and give up to win. They don't see that. They say, this is my position and I don't move, so you have to lose and I have to win. And it's not a lasting peace. It will never get there. And that's why we still have the Israeli-Palestinian problem. So I will stop here because I know you have to. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that experience. Meenakshi, you've heard your 3 panelists talked about their different experiences. And at the risk of wanting to stereotype women and their skills, why is it important to have a gender focus on peace processes? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming to this panel. It's an honor to be here for me. I just want to share with you the South Asian experience. Women in South Asia came into peace building through the corridors of human security. For them, the fetishized notion of national security just didn't work. So it meant revisiting the foundations of a monocultural understanding of what national security, the holy cow, stood for. And luckily, there was at that around the same time, in the field of international political thinking, a kind of questioning and interrogation of the premises of conventional security post-Cold War. And the feminist and critical studies perspective lent further fillip to this interrogation. And for women in South Asia, human security was defined primarily as freedom from want and freedom from fear. And you're all familiar with the very evocative definition by Mahbubul Haq, who was the author of the Human Development Report, that human security is a child that did not die, a disease that did not spread, an ethnic tension that did not burst into violent conflict, and a dissident who was not silenced. Now, women in South Asia experience what is called a peacetime war, because there is a continuum of violence where, in many senses, the personal does become the political. It's difficult in many ways to mobilize women as a homogeneous category around issues of peace, because there are fault lines of caste, class, ethnicity, and so on that divide women. One of the problems, or one of the challenges, is how do we push the frontiers of the vocabulary of peace building without being reductionist? We cannot treat women as a homogeneous category, A. B, we have to get out of the vocabulary of victimhood and look at how agency is recovered in different contexts for different people at different stages in the pre-conflict, the conflict, and the post-conflict period. And I think, to get back to 1325 did not come full-blown out of nowhere. There was a great deal of civil society activity by women on the ground to create a groundswell of opinion in favor of 1325. It happened propitiously in 2000. October, I believe, October 2000 is when the UN recognized that women had to be, and I use that word very cautiously, mainstreamed into all aspects of peacekeeping, peace building. It began as a question to the blue helmet approach and moved on through the whole spectrum of peace building, peace processes, reconciliation, and so on. So what did South Asian women do before 1325? By and large, they were invisibilized in the meta-narratives of security and indeed the meta-narratives of peace at the international realm. But they had by then begun to build transversal solidarities. Even then, the icon of Mother Sorrow was something they used because they worked for the recovery of disappeared sons who were lost in conflict. They used very interesting rituals to bring the artifacts from the private sphere into the public space as protesting, like the Greenham Commons women did by sort of hanging diapers on a missile fence to protest militarization. So there was, for women in South Asia, a deep understanding of the continuum of violence, of the structural causes of violence, of the fact that the patriarchies of family, community, and state were arraigned against them all the time. This morning we listened to Nadia's very, very moving sharing of her particular trials and her journey. Just to go back in 1947, at the Great Partition of India, where you lost, I think, 6 million lives were lost, over 1 million people were displaced. The government of India had signed in good faith something called the Recovery of Abducted Peoples Act, where the idea was that the women who were abducted by the other side, in this case the Pakistani side, had to be somehow saved and brought back to their motherland. This operation, which began as a humanitarian impulse, did not seek the consent of the women involved. Many of them were forcibly brought back, even as they had forged permanent relationships with their so-called abductors and had families by them. Of course, the rest of the story is what you can all imagine. They were erased, they were lost, their families didn't take them. But what is interesting is that community honor, and in fact even national honor, is inscribed on the bodies of women in much of the global south. And the shame of the whole process of rape and sexual violence keeps them in silence. As someone wrote, too many women in too many countries speak the same language of silence. And how do we break those silences? We can do that in the second round. I think I'm already out of my time.
Yeah, thank you. There are obviously very salient and significant stories out there, and there seems to be a gap, because it appears if you just look at 2000, the year 2000 as your starting point of assessment, looking across the world, and Anne, you can maybe come in on this. There are visible examples of successful women's role or women's engagement in peace processes through the whole gamut, from peacekeeping to peace building, peacemaking, and of conflict resolution and post-conflict. And yet you're not able to scale that up at the international level. So the 2012 study by the UN Women actually has these statistics to show that if you look at, the percentages of women at the international level of mediation and conflict resolution, 2% of women are only 2% of women have become chief mediators, only 2%. Only 4% of women have become witnesses and signatories to peace processes. And only 9% of women have actually been formal negotiators. This is at the global level. So with all of this wealth and experiences on the ground, how do you sort of scale that up at the international level? And what are some of the real challenges and obstacles that women across the world face in trying to stamp their engagement in global peace processes? You want to start again, Anne? Yeah. And sorry, I would just say, moving forward, what then can be done, right?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of things, a couple of observations. U.S. Institute of Peace has published a framework on women, peace, and security, and noted through a lot of investigations of empirical examples that when women are at the table, first step is women mediators is important, because we do also work on mediation, facilitation, and negotiation. Those are very real skills. One doesn't necessarily come to them naturally. And having a woman mediator in a peace process can be very important in terms of, it can be a man as well. The role of the mediator is to be fair, make sure everybody is respected, has equal...
And put a microphone... so that, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I tend to waver. And I'm not even Italian, anyway. So having a woman as a peace mediator at a peace negotiation can be very, very valuable. But that's just a first step. You need a fair mediator, one who's very professional. Women need to be at the table negotiating for their interest. And one area where women have shied away from, in many ways that you described so eloquently, is peace negotiations, the reforms necessary to establish a durable, sustainable peace require reforms that change the balance of power. Investigations of many cases said women are focused on reconciliation, economic growth, education, all those things are very important. Men are focused at the peace table on power relations and redistributing power relations. Women need to do this as well, because if you're at the peace table and you're making your cases and through consultation and so on, and you're there, it can be a check-the-box arrangement. You're there, you participated, great, we had women, we just ignore what they say and proceed as normal. That happens altogether too often. So women, we need to get ourselves in positions of authority, much as our colleagues here have done, to have a place at the table to help renegotiate power relationships. And it's not a win-lose situation. It's not men against women. There are plenty of men who very much recognize the value of women. Look at the new prime minister in Ethiopia. Half of his cabinet is led by women, and also in the power ministries, Justin Trudeau, and there are other examples. But women need to pay attention to power relations to really make a difference. That will change. And I would just cite one example, I thought you might do it, was the Colombian peace agreement between the government of Colombia and the FARC, long-running insurgency. Women got a place at the table. Civil society groups, advocacy groups insisted on it, but the government and the FARC themselves, even though there are many women in the FARC, were not going to do this originally. So they had support from the Norwegians and the Cubans who hosted the negotiations, and they got their seat at the table. And there was this gender subcommittee, there's a gender commission. Now, implementation is everything, right? And there are big problems with implementation. And I can give you more details, but anyway, those gender-related stipulations in the peace agreement in Colombia are being implemented at a much lower rate than other elements of the peace agreement. So follow through, persistence, a place at the table, look at power relations, always. And, just very practically, women, vote for women. But do your due diligence. If you're in a place where you have reasonably free and fair elections, support women candidates. Run for office yourself. Put yourselves in positions where you can have influence. Don't rely on others to speak for you. That's all I'll say at the moment.
You want to jump in here, Ambassador? Yeah.
Because I really,
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
I
we
just
can-
want to
yeah.
continue.
Let's continue the
What
conversation.
you
Yeah.
talked about the Colombian women. I remember when our women negotiators were in Mindanao, and I went to observe how they were doing it. And I said, what is it, what's the difference from last many years back when we didn't have you there? And the first thing they did, of course, the other side, the liberation movement, were all men. They refused to talk to the women negotiators. They were sort of, okay, you're there, but who are you anyway? And cleverly, we had, I belonged to a group called Women Peace Table. And we gathered about several women leaders. And we said, we go back there and we go with you. It was a show of force of women supporting other women. Of course, everybody knows what Madeleine Albright said, that there's a very special place in hell for women who do not help other women. Yeah. So we said, we don't want to go to hell, so we better help each other. And true enough, it changed the dynamics. And even in the presentation of positions, the other side brought in demands. What do we want from the government? This is what we want, or else we walk out. Looking at the women's side, we said, let's change the tune. And the tune was, what do you need? There was a difference between demanding and for what we want, and asking and telling, what is it do you need? It is a very interesting comment that after all the harsh words were exchanged, during the break, we went to I wasn't negotiating, and we asked the other side. We said, what is it you really need? The answer was very simple. We want to go home. So that softened the entire conversation. So we said, all right, we start from, you want to go home. How do we accomplish your wanting to go home? You know, Mindanao is one of the biggest islands in the Philippines, and the liberation group people came from different parts. And so we said, we have to look at what they needed rather than what we demand of them. Because it's amazing how it works out to the point where of course, we give and take at the end, but then you do not cause any rupture in the dialogue. You sort of work together, and it was very fulfilling. I think that was one of the major differences that I have seen in terms of how a woman brings her position to the table and how it is met by the other side. So it was rather simple, but as well, I thought was very important was to give the sense of the four women negotiators that behind them were other women who cared just as much and were prepared to do what was necessary to do. So I thought that little anecdote might give a picture of how we manage to get to a point where we agreed on the Bangsamoro law, which was evading us for not just years, decades of conflict in the south of the Philippines.
Okay, I promised that we were going to have a more interactive session. So, but maybe Ambassador Yvonne and Meenakshi can come in here quickly just to say, because I still haven't got, the need to upscale that. How, of course, this is thing about power and the need for, the style of women and trying to soften the conversation. But in terms of increasing the participation of women at the international level in peace processes.
But I think increasing the participation of women, it takes women to do that. I mean, you have to want to do it. I don't think you can do it if you don't want to do it. And that's, I think, the problem mostly, that maybe women, they don't like because they are doing what they like to do, and they think it's very difficult to go and fight on this kind of thing. Maybe, that's a possibility. It's changing a lot. But that's what I feel when I tell even my sisters, why don't you get involved? In Arabic, and why do I have to do it when I'm relaxed? Why to vote? So sometimes you have to see that nowadays, it's not a need, it's an obligation for women to interfere. That's what I'm trying to really say, that it's an obligation because we have to do something. We're going into a very wrong direction more and more. Yeah. So going back to the thing that I think women are innate negotiators and mediators. We are born with it. When you wake up in the morning as a mother and you are in a bad mood, the whole house is in a bad mood. The whole home is in a bad mood. It's a thermometer. The woman is a thermometer of the home. And she's an innate negotiator because she starts negotiating with her children what you have to have breakfast, what you want to have, asking the questions, negotiating with the husband, what is the day. So it's in her. And she's not only a negotiator, she's an economist, she's an administrator, she's a chef, she's everything. So a woman has this potential of having different compartments that she can do many things at the same time. So that's why the role of women is so important in a society that we have now, most than ever, that it's so interconnected and we need so much of the love that's missing, the care that's missing, the passion that's missing, that we see everything's about greed and more and more and more and more accumulation of material and not thinking about the values and the ethics that are being lost. So I want to just, because you were saying something about the questions, a story that came to me that Roger Fisher used to say, and he got it in his book, Getting to Yes, about a family that had two boys, and both of them worked, and they shared. He will go to work, and she will stay at home with the children, and when she goes, he will stay. But one day, she said, I have to work all day, so you have to stay with the kids all day. So she went, and when she came back, it was a mess. The house was a complete mess. And everything was, they are crying, the children were not talking with each other, they were fighting. And she came and she said, what's happening? You go and take care of your children. What is this? They are fighting about everything. Imagine, they wanted an orange. And they wanted an orange. And I said, well, we don't have an orange, we have only one. And they said, okay, but I want one, complete one. And the other one said, I want a complete. So what he did, the father cut the orange in half, and gave one half to one and one half to others, and they started crying more because everyone wanted the whole orange. So the mother arrives when all this mess is going on, and she goes and she asks the question, why do you want the whole orange? And one of them said, I want the whole orange because I want to peel it and make a cake out of it, and I need the whole peeling. And she asked the other one, why do you want the orange? She said, I want to make a glass of juice, and half of it is not enough, so I want the whole. So what she did, she peeled the whole orange, she gave the peel to the one, and she gave the whole orange of the juice for the other. So there are differing interests, so we don't see that. Sometimes men, they don't see the interest because they don't ask the question. So instead of doing it, he cuts it in half. It's like when you're having a gun, and instead of asking the question before you shoot, you don't do that. That's why we are innate in that asking and trying to find a solution. And everything has a solution without going to the violent part of doing it immediately. So that's what I wanted to say, that I think it's important.
Okay, Meenakshi, quickly, yeah.
I think we have to sort of watch out. We have to sort of be careful that, of two dangers. The danger of slipping into a very essentializing view of women as naturally peacemaking. I mean, the fact that women can be used as agents to build peace is because they experience marginalization and are acutely aware of injustice. And therefore, they can intervene on behalf of the marginalized in ways in which their own experiences lends credence and credibility to their work. The second is that we have to resist tokenism. This add women and stir is not about gender. And I would like for the WPS agenda to move a little more towards the gender peace and security agenda, because it includes both men and women and the relational dynamics of how they actually move in. Luckily for us, and I'm going to take a minute here, is that the notion of a woman as passively holy and wholly passive, the woman in white as the epitome of peace, has changed. Because now you have a legion of disobedient women who are rocking the ship of the state. Just to share with you, Rosa Parks, when she went on that bus, didn't think she was going to make a revolution, but she was tied to her seat because of her dignity. She got thrown off the bus and lit the shall I say, dynamite, social dynamite fire. And then because Rosa sat, Martin walked. And because Martin walked, Obama could run. So there is a whole series of initiatives, I think, that women can take that allows them to open other perspectives on the use of power. And I think power is not pushing down, but pulling up, all those kind of things that we have learned about. And there are different methodologies that women bring to the peace table, but I don't think we should be obsessed at being at the peace table. It's not just about numeric representation, but substantively what do we bring to the peace table. So from the village council to the negotiating table is a continuum, and each level has its own supportive work. So I personally feel that today the UN is talking about the importance of civil society in peace work. It began the other way. It began with civil society before 1325, and now 1325 is saying involve civil society much more. Each level has to find its place. Thank you.
But there are other, I just also wanted to flag that there are other things that we really need to work together. For example, there is a need to have a register of women peace builders and peacemakers. And I think in the context of Asia, you can speak to this maybe later on, Ambassador Albert, but you know, when you are in the UN, you are with the UN, the Department of Political Affairs, and you have this section called the Mediation Unit. They need to also be informed about who are the peacemakers out there across the world, and the only way perhaps for you to be seen and to be known is to have a kind of an approach or methodology whether this information can get through to the highest level, at the global level. And you know, a lot of things I think are required, a lot of thinking as to how you actually bring this representation from the bottom up at the global level. All right, so with that, I would like to invite comments, questions from the floor. I think we have about 20 minutes, and I know that there's a tendency to have a long commentary before we ask a question, but in the interest of time and getting more voices in, can you keep your questions brief? And if you want to direct it to a specific panelist, please indicate at the start, all right? So I am visually challenged, so whoever comes to me first. Right, I recognize the lady on the second row, please. Yeah.
Thank you. So I am a veteran of the military of the United States. And Mrs. Gopinath, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, but I really resonated with your statement regarding adding women and stirring, because that is something that the United States military tends to do. They make women partake in these positions, but in reality they don't have a room at the table or cannot make any of the decisions for the most part. And so so we talked about what women can do in order to kind of, you know, fix that problem, but what can men do?
Yes, okay. I will gather a few questions before I come back to the panel. Right, so what can men do? To be even, I'll have one here. Yes, please.
Hello, thank you very much for your remarks. I'm Ragad Al-Sadi, a consultant at the UN right now on humanitarian access and protection of women and children in Syria. So my question is that for women in peace negotiations, in your experience, have you negotiated with women who are part of the conflicts or perpetuating conflicts? And if so, is that easier to achieve good results rather than negotiating with men in power?
Okay. One more question. Right there, please. Yes, the gentleman at the back. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. You're right. We should not be essentializing, but maybe we should try to pour old wine in new bottles. What I'm meaning here is that women playing a role in peacekeeping or peace-seeking is not new. For instance, in Africa, we have seen women threatening their husbands and their family if they don't stop war, that they would go on strike as housewives and housekeepers. And we have seen also other women threatening their son soldiers that if they did not stop fighting, they would go naked in the streets. So I mean, history show that women have always been peace brokers, and this is extremely important. And I, for one, I'm sure that if I were to be told by somebody, go to war and be a hero, there are two reactions. My father would say, go to war, fight and die and be a hero. My mother would say, wait a minute, sit down, let's find another solution for my son to be a hero. Finally, we are not essentializing. Rosa Parks did what she did in order to seek peace. But Leila Khaled also did what she did some 20 years ago to seek peace. Thank you.
Thank you for those.
My name is Usman Sen. I am from Senegal, West Africa Research Center. This lady certainly knows.
All right, thank you. We have a comment and two questions. There was one specific question about to you, Meenakshi, on what can we do? What can men do?
You spoke about peacekeeping, women.
No, in the military.
Women
Yeah.
peacekeeping units. I do want to share with you that there was an all-women peacekeeping force from India in Liberia, and when they came back, and they apparently worked very well with the local communities. And I spoke to the leader, the commander, Seema Bhukia, about how she felt when she went in there, because it was a place that she had never known about before she went. And she said, I had to contend with so many challenges, even within my family. And they said, why don't you look after your children rather than going out there to secure peace for someone else? So there were all these mindsets that were at the same time operating. One of the things I think that, and I'm so deeply appreciative of our brother from Africa, who said that he recognizes that sustaining life, weaving the web, the tapestry of life, has been one of the primary impulses for motherhood, and in some senses, traditionally womanhood. And that is indeed true. But men can recognize that these structural constraints that operate on women because of the nature of power relations in society continues to be unjust and doesn't allow us to meet our potential for peace. So that's one of the things. Then in higher echelons of government and the international institutions, as the report on 1325 had pointed out, that the UN needs to have a much more gender-sensitive architecture. Not just increase the numbers of women in the higher echelons of peace building and peacekeeping, but also invest them with authority, make arrangements, for example, childcare arrangement, financial arrangements for women who are hazarding to go out there into the field to build peace. Human rights monitors, for example, are not always protected, and they put themselves tremendously out on the line. So this cannot be done. This is a sort of it has to be a global compact, which cannot be done by women in isolation. It has to be a combined sort of shared responsibility, a collaboration between men and women. About Africa, you know, in terms of mediation, the women's networks are so vibrant. We know what happened in Kenya in 2008 and how they intervened so effectively. And the fact that they dip into these regional networks has given them an enormous sense of solidarity across the countries, across many countries in Africa. And I think building networks, building solidarities, and also supporting them from both within the UN and by governments could be one way forward. I don't know if I've answered your question. Thank you.
There was a specific question on what do you do, how do you deal with women who are actually combatants. Yeah, maybe, Anne, would you like to come in here? You have it.
Combatants has been in the FARC kind of.
Yes.
Wait, you know, it's difficult to say how they feel, women that combatants. They have to be feeling so bad in order for them to go for something like that, I believe. I believe that we are, in a way, parents are in the thought how do we raise our children also. How we raise the girls, how we raise the boys. And we raise our children, boys, to defend, and we raise the girls to be different. So it's different. But when you talk about the FARCs and the girls go inside, it's because of desperation, because they are changed in political ways that they will be in extreme because of poverty. I always say that everything happens because they go into the extreme of having nothing to lose. And we are creating a society now in the world of the people that have nothing to lose. And when you create a society of the nothing to lose, you will have terrorists. You will have people that will react that way. So I believe this is something that we have to deal very much in the societies, why this is happening. And I don't like this thing that these are terrorists and these are not terrorists. Terrorists are those that create terror, no matter who they are. We are having so much all over. I'm not going to mention what countries are creating and what not. But if you ask the question, any person, what do you want and what is for you happiness? The only thing I always hear from everyone is, I want to be included in society as a human being. So it means that there is something missing in that part. When you are not included, when you are left aside, when you have nothing to lose, when you cannot feed your children, when you can do nothing to give them something and have dignity. If I had children, I cannot do that, I will become also that. So you put yourself in the place of how they feel.
Okay. Yeah, I think we asked Dalit to come in on what else can be done, perhaps at the national level, to address issues about...
Yeah. Well, we're quite, I would say, unique in the region. It's unique in the sense that we have had really women leaders, and not just in parliament, etc. And why is this so? Well, education came very early in our history. And general education is, to me, the biggest vehicle for social mobility as well as for leadership. But interestingly enough, we have passed legislations to help women to move on in their career. For example, we have by law the implementation of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against women, which, by the way, we started the first draft, which we were part of in the early days. And we have legislated what we call the Gender and Development Law, which requires every government office to allocate strictly 5% of its total budget to ensure that there is consciousness that you've heard about the leaking pipe. When women start having children, they leave the mid-level management of offices, etc. So that fund within every government office is dedicated to helping women who start having children, they have the daycare center, etc., etc. And a second one that came after this gender and development law was the Magna Carta for Women. And the Magna Carta for Women in the Philippines monitors the actions, not just of the public sector, but also of the private sector, again in relation to the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women, because we've taken that very seriously, and I think it has helped us. And looking at leadership, we have started in ASEAN, this is a group of 10 countries, a directory of women who have trained to be negotiators, and we are moving on to have more professional way of training the skills of our diplomats to be able to mediate and negotiate, very similar to what the Nordic countries have done in the north, where they have taken a very active role in the Yemen negotiations recently, and in Norway has also helped us with our other issues. But now we want our own women in the region to be able to be skilled
having a pool of experts. Okay, I'm really sorry, but I've been reminded that we are past the time, although we started quite late. I think we were behind 10 minutes, so I don't want to claim that. But maybe just to give a chance for the two other panelists to say something, maybe very briefly, Anne. Maybe last, because I don't think...
I want to underscore what my colleague has said. We don't want to homogenize women. After all, we have very reactionary women and so on. You can think of examples of that. At the same time, as I mentioned before, this is not a gender battle. This is finding like-minded people who want working together to make reforms necessary. When we look at conflict, these don't emerge out of whole cloth. These do not just appear from nowhere. As you said, they develop from deep-seated grievances. Labeling an organization a terrorist organization or not is a political decision with political implications. So men and women need to work together, but women need more voice at the table to fashion the reforms that are necessary to create a durable peace. For too long, half of the population has been marginalized, and it's frankly not worked very well. So let's go for something that has more positive potential. Thank you.
Okay. Just one quick question. Yes, please. And then, this is the last question. I'm sorry. You can always ask the panelists later, but can you make it very quick?
Yes. After hearing Nadia this morning, where she talked about really wanting to see justice as a way of making sure that women weren't reinforced as second-class citizens, I then came to the session on struggling for justice in Palestine, Syria, and Yemen, and it was all men on the panel, and there was discussions about constitutional committees to create, going forward in Syria and Yemen, and it just didn't feel like women were part of that at all. How do we continue to press to make sure that in order that women aren't reinstituted or as those second-class citizens, to try and meet what Nadia talked about this morning, that we get that seat at the table, we're part of that constitutional committee when creating new policies and moving forward, and that's globally, not just in those situations.
Okay, thank you. Right.
Comment? I working with the United Nations, I've looked at mediators and negotiators. I've never seen a woman's name. Perhaps it's a time that the United Nations assign a woman to be a chief negotiator of some of the
Existing conflicts, yes. Okay. Meenakshi, you want to have the last word before we close the panel? No?
I did want to say that the fact that you mentioned ex-combatant women, ex-combatant, 30% of the Maoist cadres in Nepal were women. Similarly with the LTTE in Sri Lanka. But after the war, after the end of the hostilities, many of them were marginalized. While many combatants were integrated into the Nepalese army, the women combatants were completely left out. And as the ambassador said, they joined the movement because they thought they would get equal representation and dignity and overcome class and caste barriers. It happened for a spell. But like Rosie the Revetter, there was a pushback. And you're absolutely right, ma'am. How do we break these barriers? So we just have to say, nothing about us without us. And we have to completely believe in that and push forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, thanks very much for patiently and staying on a little bit. I know we went beyond our time, the allocated time, but obviously from this 1 hour conversation, it always leaves me that it's never enough. It's not just in time, but really bring in a lot of issues that we need to think about when we want to increase the participation of women in peace processes. It's undoubted. There's no doubt that women are important. They have to be part of the negotiation, part of mediation peace processes, but how to get them physically involved right there. And break some of the barriers at the international level, and really to ensure that we have half of the sky. All right, so thank you very much. And once again, can I show your appreciation, we show your appreciation to the panelists. Thank you.